When an elderly woman entered the elegant restaurant, no one could have guessed that her quiet presence would reveal a shocking truth and make the entire room come to a standstill. The late afternoon sun gently illuminated the large glass windows of a prestigious bistro in Portland, Oregon. Inside, a calm atmosphere prevailed, interrupted only by occasional sounds. At that moment, the door swung open, and an elderly black woman walked in. Her steps were slow but confident, and her posture remained straight despite the passage of time, leaving its mark on her figure. She wore a dark blue coat with delicate embroidery on the cuffs, and a small black handbag rested neatly under her arm. Her face was serene, yet carried a quiet authority that subtly drew the attention of a few guests. The hostess greeted her with a smile, though there was a faint hint of tension behind it. "Do you have a reservation, ma'am?" she asked, glancing quickly over her shoulder, as if worried about holding up the line. "Yes, under the name Mrs. Holloway," the woman replied in an even, polite tone. The hostess checked the list, nodded, and led her to a table near the kitchen. It was far from the best seat in the house, but Mrs. Holloway voiced no complaint. She sat down, placed her hands on the table, and began scanning the menu. But soon something felt off. Minutes passed, then more. The waiter assigned to her section, a tall man in his 30s named Todd, walked past her table several times, barely acknowledging her presence. When he finally stopped, his smile was thin and his tone devoid of warmth. "Sorry for the wait," he said. "We're really busy today. I'll be back in a bit to take your order." Mrs. Holloway gave him a gracious nod and thanked him, though she noticed how other guests, younger and dressed more casually, were receiving far more attentive service. She caught a few glances. One woman at a nearby table whispered something to her companion while discreetly looking in her direction. Another diner frowned, as if trying to figure out why she seemed out of place. Time stretched on, but Todd did not return. When he finally did, his tone remained indifferent. "Apologies, but we're short-staffed today. You might have to wait a bit longer," he said without the slightest trace of concern. "Take your time," Mrs. Holloway replied with a composed smile. There was no sign of frustration in her voice. She had no intention of causing a scene. Still, the tension in the air was becoming palpable. Sitting quietly in her corner, she observed the room. This was not the first time she had encountered such treatment. Never overt, but always present in delayed service, in dismissive glances. Yet she remained poised, her hands resting calmly on the table, as if she were simply waiting. Meanwhile, Todd tended to other tables with ease, chatting and laughing with guests. As he passed Mrs. Holloway again without even a glance, a growing unease settled among some of the other diners. A young couple in the center of the room exchanged concerned looks. "Why hasn't that table been served yet?" the woman murmured, her voice barely audible over the soft music. Her partner shrugged and shot a quick glance at Todd, who seemed entirely unbothered. Seconds turned into long minutes. Though Mrs. Holloway maintained her composed demeanor, a small part of her wondered just how far this would go. She reached for her glass of water, only to find it empty. A few tables away, a waiter poured a fresh glass of wine for a guest who had arrived much later than she had. At last, Todd returned, carrying a tray of food for another table. He paused momentarily as he passed her. "You still haven't decided?" he asked, his tone carrying a hint of condescension, as if the delay were her fault. Mrs. Holloway looked up at him, her gaze steady, kind, yet carrying a quiet intensity that made him hesitate for a moment. "I'll place my order when you have a moment," she said, her voice calm and courteous. Todd gave a quick nod, muttered something under his breath, and walked away. A few tables away, someone had been closely watching the situation unfold. At a table near the bar, a man in his 30s sat with a half-empty glass of water in front of him. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit, his posture was calm yet rigid, his narrowed eyes carefully following Todd's behavior. Quietly, he noted every interaction, every slight, and every dismissive glance. His fingers tapped lightly on the table's edge, his expression growing colder with each passing minute. Though he remained silent, his gaze flickered between Mrs. Holloway and the restaurant staff. He was not just another customer. He was the owner of the restaurant, and Mrs. Holloway was his mother. But he did not intervene, at least not yet. He wanted to see just how far this would go. how Todd would continue treating someone he perceived as powerless. His jaw clenched as he watched Todd laughing with another table, oblivious to the storm brewing on the other side of the room. The tension in the restaurant was growing, pressing in like an invisible weight. Though Mrs. Holloway remained poised, the atmosphere was becoming heavier by the second. Something was bound to happen. It was only a matter of time. At the far end of the dining room, Elijah Holloway leaned back in his chair, his fingers continuing their slow, rhythmic tapping. He was not a man who lost his temper easily. Years in the restaurant industry had taught him that patience was often his greatest weapon. But this was different. Watching his mother endure this, subtle yet deliberate disrespect, awakened something deep within him. This was not just about business. This was about the values his mother had instilled in him: respect, integrity, and fairness. She had been his pillar during his hardest years, the voice that had urged him to keep pushing forward when everything was against him. And now, seeing her treated as if she had no right to exist in the very space he had built, this felt personal. He noticed how Todd deliberately avoided her table, how he smiled so easily at other guests but stiffened the moment his gaze landed on her. Elijah caught the brief smirk Todd exchanged with another waiter, as if sharing some unspoken joke. His grip on his glass tightened. This restaurant was his domain, his pride. Every detail, from the menu to the decor, bore his signature. Yet in this moment, he felt powerless. There was only one person in this world he would never allow to be disrespected, and here she was, enduring it with quiet dignity. Elijah debated his next move. Should he confront Todd now, making an example of him in front of the entire restaurant? Or should he let the moment play out, ensuring there would be no room for excuses later? He chose the latter. Signaling to the restaurant's manager, a middle-aged woman named Dana, he spoke in a low, firm voice. "Keep an eye on table 12, he instructed, nodding toward his mother. "I want to see how Todd handles this. Don't intervene yet." Dana hesitated but then nodded. She knew better than to question Elijah when his tone carried that level of authority. His gaze returned to Mrs. Holloway. She had just glanced at her watch, her movements slow and measured. He knew she wouldn't complain. She never did. Complaints had never been her way. She had always believed that actions spoke louder than words. Elijah believed in actions too, and soon Todd would learn exactly where his actions would lead him. The tension in the restaurant had reached its breaking point. Conversations had quieted, and more guests were now sneaking glances toward Mrs. Holloway's table. Todd, on the other hand, remained indifferent, perhaps even defiant, as he passed by her table once more. She raised a hand politely. "Excuse me," she said softly. Her voice cut through the murmur of the room. Todd stopped in his tracks, his expression shifting to one of thinly veiled impatience. "What?" he asked curtly, barely hiding his irritation. "I'd like to place my order," she replied. "If you're not too busy." "Yeah, in a minute," he muttered, turning away before she could respond. And at that moment Elijah rose from his seat. His movements were slow and deliberate, yet they commanded attention. It was as if the entire room shifted as he crossed it, his presence carrying an unspoken authority. Without a word, he walked straight toward Todd. "I'm just observing," Elijah replied calmly, his voice carrying an undeniable authority. Todd's smile faltered. "Observing? Why?" Elijah's gaze shifted from his mother's table back to Todd. "Observing how you've been ignoring my mother, who has been sitting here for almost 30 minutes without even receiving a glass of water." The color drained from Todd's face. He glanced at Mrs. Holloway, who now sat upright, her composed gaze fixed on the scene unfolding before her. Mother?" Todd stammered, his voice unsteady. "Yes, my mother," Elijah said, his tone sharpening. "The woman you've treated like a burden. The woman you deemed unworthy of the same respect you show every other table in this restaurant." A heavy silence fell over the room. Every eye was now on them. Even the pianist had stopped mid-note, his fingers hovering over the keys. Todd opened his mouth to speak, but Elijah cut him off. "Enough," he said coldly. "There is no excuse for what you've done, and everyone here saw it." Elijah turned to the manager, who stood uncertainly by the bar, unsure whether to intervene. "Dana," he said evenly, "take care of my mother's table." Then fixing Todd with a steely look, he added, "We'll discuss your future here later. But for now, you're done for the night. Go home." Todd stood motionless for a moment, his face a mixture of humiliation and regret. Then, without a word, he untied his apron and walked out of the restaurant. The heavy door swung shut behind him. For a moment, the silence lingered. Then Elijah stepped toward his mother's table. He crouched slightly so he could meet her eyes, his stern expression softening into something warmer. "Are you all right, Mom?" he asked quietly. Mrs. Holloway smiled gently, reaching out to place a comforting hand on his. "I'm fine, son," she assured him. "You handled that well." Elijah exhaled, the tension in his shoulders easing. "I should have stepped in sooner." "No," she replied softly. "You let him reveal his true character. Sometimes that's more powerful than immediate confrontation." As the restaurant gradually returned to its usual hum of conversation, it was clear that no one would forget what had just happened. The atmosphere had shifted. Conversations continued, but the air was heavier, more thoughtful. Those who had witnessed the exchange now looked at Mrs. Holloway with a newfound respect and quiet admiration. Elijah returned to his seat, his face composed, though a flicker of anger still lingered in his eyes. Meanwhile, Dana made sure Mrs. Holloway's dinner was served promptly, her apology evident in her careful attention. It was as if she was trying to make up for the entire evening in that one gesture. Mrs. Holloway accepted the apology with her usual grace, offering Dana a small nod before returning to her meal. She did not need grand gestures or lengthy speeches. Her quiet dignity spoke for itself. At a nearby table, a young couple who had witnessed the entire situation leaned toward each other. "I can't believe he treated her like that," the woman murmured. "It's not just about what you see," her partner said thoughtfully. "It's about whether you're willing to stand against it when it happens." Elijah overheard them as he walked past on his way back to his mother's table. Their words stayed with him. He thought of the countless times people like Todd had acted with impunity simply because no one had been watching or no one had cared enough to intervene. When Elijah sat down beside his mother, she reached across the table and took his hand. "You've built something special here, Elijah," she said gently. "But remember, this place isn't just about food or atmosphere. It's about how people feel when they walk through these doors." "I know, Mom," Elijah replied, his voice laced with regret. "I let you down today." She shook her head. "No, you didn't. You gave everyone here the chance to see the truth, and you handled it with integrity." The restaurant felt different now. The service became more attentive, more thoughtful. It was no longer just about avoiding another incident. It was an unspoken lesson, a quiet shift in the culture of the place. Respect and kindness weren't optional. They were the foundation of everything. As Mrs. Holloway finished her meal, she glanced around the restaurant. For a moment, her eyes landed on Dana, who offered her a small, apologetic smile. There was no resentment in Mrs. Holloway's expression, only quiet satisfaction. The moment had left its mark. This situation was a reminder not just for Todd, but for the entire staff, and even for Elijah himself. Leadership isn't just about managing operations. It's about upholding the values that make a restaurant a place worth visiting. As the evening came to an end, Mrs. Holloway prepared to leave. Her calm demeanor remained unchanged. Elijah walked her to the door, holding it open as she stepped into the cool night air. For a moment they stood there, illuminated by the soft glow of the restaurant's lights. "You did well, son," she said. There was warmth in her voice, softening the tension of the evening. Elijah offered a faint smile. "I still wish it hadn't happened at all." She placed a gentle hand on his. "It's not about what happened. It's about how you responded. You gave everyone here something to think about, something they will take with them. That is real change." Elijah nodded, watching as she walked toward the car waiting at the curb. Just before getting in, she gave him one last reassuring smile. Though the incident had passed, it had not been forgotten. Dana gathered the staff for a brief meeting. Her tone was serious but constructive. "What happened tonight should serve as a wake-up call. This isn't just about how we treat our guests. It's about the culture we create here. Every person who walks through these doors deserves respect. No exceptions." The staff nodded, their faces showing not just agreement, but understanding. The atmosphere had shifted. Where there had once been silent complacency, there was now professionalism and awareness. When Elijah returned to the dining room, he looked around. The space was empty now, but the weight of the evening still lingered. Yet, instead of burdening him, it strengthened his resolve. Pemberton Bistro had to be more than just a place that served fine food. It had to be a place where every person's dignity was honored. For the guests who had witnessed the night's events, this evening would not be forgotten. They had come for a meal, but they left with a story that reminded them of the power of respect, the importance of standing up for what is right, and the quiet strength of those who refuse to let injustice define their world. And now consider this. If you were in their place, what would you have done? Would you have spoken up? Or would you have stood by, letting it unfold? These moments aren't always obvious, but they are everywhere. Let this story be a reminder. Every time, we have a choice between indifference and dignity, between silence and empathy. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe and share it. Only through these conversations do we grow together.